Yep, we've got you covered. Sell, buy home loans, OfferPad can help you do it all. In fact, yep, we've got you covered. Sell, buy home loans, OfferPad can help you do it all. In fact,
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for talking back. Thank you so much for coming today. I am Deborah Omawale Jarman, the CEO of the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum, or affectionately known as SACAM. SACAM's mission is to collect, preserve, and share the African American cultural heritage, of the San Antonio region. We recognize there are people of African descent living in the area that don't identify with the term African American, but will identify with African, African Caribbean, African Indigenous, African, and of course, African Mexican. As we think about the multicultural makeup of the city we call home, one has to wonder, how did we get here? Recognizing that is a loaded question, today we will explore that very question. How did we get here? How did we get here physically, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, economically, and politically? Today will stir up thoughts and maybe emotions as we consider how, according to the Constitution of the Republic of Texas, African descendants and Indians, by the way, were not considered citizens, but have managed to find a place to call home. How the intersection of Mexico, the Republic of Texas, and the United States of America created a rich, diverse, and even convoluted history of the indigenous, colonists, Mexicans, settlers, and the enslaved. I invite you to keep an open mind, give yourself and each other space and grace as we navigate this research together. Thank you all so much for coming, and enjoy your day. Dr. Daniel Ott.
Is there a way to advance the slide? I will give a brief introduction about myself, about my program. My name is Dan Ott. I'm a little bit uncomfortable behind the podium. I work for the National Underground Railroad Network. Our program One of the really cool parts about this is I think when most people think about Underground Railroad, they think about Quakers, hidey holes in basements in the Ohio Valley, and they think about Harriet Tubman for good reason. But we try to pivot that towards an understanding of Black agency. We try to think about it in terms of wherever enslaved people existed across our country, they very naturally sought to get free. And that includes places like Texas, which people don't necessarily appreciate. That includes places like California. That includes places like my home state of Minnesota. And I'm really glad that we had this opportunity as a program to get together with the folks at SACAM to make contact with Crystal Mendez, who's busily working on my IT issues. I appreciate it, Crystal, and Deborah, and also to connect with scholars across the country, particularly Dr. O'Dane and Dr. Hammock, as well as national park units like our friends from San Antonio Missions, so that we can try to address historical silences with truth-telling about the real history of the full historical experience of our country, including not just the well-known political history of presidents, but also the history of African Americans across our country, and slavery, as well as resistance to slavery and Underground Railroad. I had a slide to show you guys, which I thought was kind of important. But I want you to imagine a map of the United States. I'm going to describe the slide to you. We have 767 sites that we recognize as part of Underground Railroad in our program. Imagine the map of the United States, and more than half of those sites are in the Chesapeake Bay area, and they are in the Ohio River Valley area, right? So the number one state that has the most listings is Ohio, 99 sites, and the number two site is Maryland, which has 98 sites. Now, would anyone venture a guess about how many sites that we have in 25 years that are in the western United States? I'd say Texas all the way to Hawaii. Who would like to venture a guess about how many sites we have in the Network to Freedom in that area? Got a guess? 150. Anyone think it's higher or lower? Lower. It is 17. 17 sites in the western United States. I am the Western Regions Coordinator for the Underground Railroad program. I've been here for about 3 months, and my goal is to get more awareness of slavery and freedom seeking and to get more sites recognized as part of our nationally significant history. And part of that is bringing together people like yourselves to learn about it. And part of it is getting people excited about this history so that we can wind up advancing it and getting more sites designated as part of the program. And then as part of that also creating opportunities to take those sites and elevate them and interpret them for the American public through trails, signs, interpretive programs, digital facilities, and that kind of thing. That being said, I think I've covered all of the stuff that was in my slides. Wait. There's the map. There's the map of the United States of all of our sites. And this is the thing what I wanted to sort of say is one of my goals is I know that freedom seekers were everywhere. And if you look at our map, you can see that there's a lot missing. And our goal is to try and broaden those stories, not just by telling stories about escapes, but also stories about lives that people made in freedom. We don't just sort of focus on the moment of escape, but we try and tell the entire story of freedom seekers. So that's how you wind up with people. The one guy I got in Hawaii, he didn't escape from Hawaii. He escaped from Norfolk, Virginia on a whaling boat, spent 30 years as a whaler, and then wound up settling in Hawaii, where he felt like he was treated better in the 1830s. But that's just sort of a little bit of background about the program. I'll probably say more later, and I've probably talked longer than I was supposed to. But thank you so much for being here. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much to all the partners who participated on this. And with that, I will hand it back to Deborah.
Thank you. So I just take orders, and our historian, Crystal Mendez, said, so Deborah, you're going to be the host. So I'm going to tell you all what, you'll be the host because you have a program. And Deborah really doesn't like to talk, even though some people may differ, especially my husband. So I'm going to encourage you to follow your program. And next we have the amazing Dr. Michaela Audane. Thank you.
Good morning. So I want to thank everyone who worked so hard to organize the symposium. I mentioned to Deborah and Crystal that it wasn't even 9:30 and so many people had shown up. And so that's always great. As a historian, sometimes I give talks and there's like 8 people there. So it's so nice to have people who are interested in our work. And I was also telling Deborah one of the important things to me about being a historian, and something I've noticed in the past few years is that historians are just talking to other historians and not the people who have an interest in this work that we do, especially people of the community. And so I'm really glad to be a participant, and I'm looking forward to sharing my work and my research, and also hearing and learning from other presentations later today. So a note about language. So scholars who study African-American, enslaved African-Americans, we've moved away from using words like slave or slaveholder. And so now we use enslaved person to recognize the humanity of enslaved Black people, and enslaver to highlight the action of enslaving Black people against their will. And so during this presentation, I'll use those words. I'll also use phrases like freedom seeker and fugitives from slavery. This is a new development in terms of how historians discuss people who fled slavery. When I first heard it, I thought that was a very awkward phrase to say, but then in doing my research in Texas newspapers, I actually saw the term freedom seeker keep reoccurring. So I was like, oh, this is actually historically accurate. So using freedom seeker and fugitives from slavery to show that enslaved Texans actively pursued freedom and tried to escape the condition of enslavement. So to begin my presentation, I want to start with a story. 48-year-old Andre was born into Natchitoches slavery in the 1780s. He'd been baptized as Catholic and he owned 2 horses. News that his enslaver was intending to sell him prompted him to run away. In preparation for his journey, Andre he stole 2 additional horses, a gun, gunpowder, clothing, and some other items. His niece even gave him a mule. He fled in early March 1817. His goal was to reach Spanish Texas because he heard that he could be free there. So he followed El Camino Real, the King's Highway, through the piney wood region of northern Louisiana and navigated the forest made up of pine and cedar trees as he gradually approached the Sabine River. After crossing the river, he entered Texas. Although he was in free territory, he continued southwest. When traveling, he met 2 Spaniards and an indigenous man who he thought was a member of the Chancawa. After 22 days of travel and more than 400 miles traversed, he finally arrived in San Antonio de Bejar, the capital of Spanish Texas. In San Antonio, Spanish officials interviewed him. Initially, they were actually surprised that he was enslaved because he had so much stuff with him, and they couldn't believe that someone enslaved would have all of these things. And so he explained to them how his niece had lent him a mule, and how his enslaver had allowed him to own horses, and how he'd been able to accumulate so many things for his journey. But he did all this through an interpreter who spoke Spanish and French. And he answered their questions about where he was from, and why he had escaped, and who he had seen during his travels. Although sources don't reveal what happened to Andre after the interview, he was able to answer officials' questions and presumably remained free there. And so this example shows us that in the early 19th century, San Antonio was a space of freedom for enslaved people in the Louisiana-Texas borderland. Spanish Texas had become a haven for freedom seekers when a royal decree passed that allowed fugitives from foreign territories to be free in colonial Mexico, which was under Spanish rule. For enslaved people in northern Louisiana, Texas became the primary place for people to be free because there were so few and determine their course of freedom and what it would look like without anyone else's input. And so despite this option of maroonage, fugitives still viewed Texas as a haven and fled there. And Spanish officials were really interested in what freedom seekers had to say about their travels. But it wasn't for altruistic reasons. In the 1810s, Mexico was in a war of independence against Spain, and its officials wanted to know if there was any rebellious sentiment in Texas. The fugitives never reported that there was anything. But for historians and the work that I do, these interviews provide insight into who the freedom seekers were. Most of what we know about freedom seekers comes from newspapers, so think about the advertisements announcing an escape, and that provided a description of the person who ran away. Or from abolitionist writings, think about William Still, who assisted people in Philadelphia, and he actually recorded the stories of nearly all of the people that he assisted, and he published it in a book in 1872. And then also from formerly enslaved people who wrote their narratives and memoirs. These are all the ways that we learn about freedom seekers. But in the absence of these materials in the Louisiana-Texas borderlands, these interviews are the closest thing we have to direct testimony that's available. It's from Andreas's testimony that we learn about slavery in northern Louisiana. We learn that he was an older enslaved man who spoke French and was Catholic. We learned something about his family life, that he had a niece who supported his dreams for freedom, that he owned horses, that he knew how to use a gun, that he believed that he needed a weapon and additional clothing and a lot of items to help him prepare for escape. But most importantly, We learn that Andres knew that Spanish territory was a place to be free, and that San Antonio was the place where he thought he should end his journey to freedom. And so this talk opened with a discussion of San Antonio as a destination for Andres, while Texas was under Spanish rule. So this talk will trace San Antonio's role in slavery and freedom in the Republic of Texas in the 1830s, and then when Texas was a new U.S. state in the mid-1840s. Over the course of these 2 decades, the meaning of freedom changed in San Antonio, and it changed for fugitives from slavery. They faced obstacles when trying to reach the city and also trying to remain free there. And so I'm going to look at 3 things. I'm going to trace how fugitives thought about San Antonio as a part of their journeys and like as a marker to freedom, and as an informal space of freedom. I'll consider how escape in Texas was different from the U.S. North. And so thinking about how the experiences of freedom seekers in Texas was very unique from what we already know. And then lastly, looking at local consequences of enslaved resistance. So Mexico abolished slavery in 1829, but President Guerrero made an exception for Texas. And so under this exemption, Texas slavery grew exponentially. Nearly 5,000 enslaved people were in Texas by 1836. And so with more enslaved people, that meant that more people were trying to escape. For example, in April 1832, Peter and his son John escaped from their enslaver, Alexander Thompson. The fugitives had to carefully navigate the earliest stages of their escape from San Felipe Austin, which was located near the Brazos River. They needed to avoid patrols and other plantations in the area. They managed to traverse the prairie grass landscape of Austin Colony and traveled over 150 miles to reach San Antonio. And once they arrived, they presented themselves to the commander, Ramon Musquiz. He arranged for their protection, but he didn't include any long-term plans about what would happen to them. Meanwhile, their enslaver Thompson had hired a group of kidnappers, 7 Anglo kidnappers, to capture the father and son, and who had fled slavery. They arrived at Behar by the end of May, kidnapped Peter and John, and returned them to Thompson. From this example, we learn a few things about San Antonio and freedom in Texas, based on the choices that Peter and John made during the escape. The first point, 15 years after Andreas had escaped, Peter and John's experiences show the preparations of escape had evolved. Unlike Andreas, Peter and John decided to escape together, and on foot, and unarmed. With their enslaver, they didn't have as much access to horses and weapons, and traveling on foot, they couldn't travel that far away. So instead, they probably selected San Antonio because it was close. And despite Texas's exemption from slavery, enslaved Texans still viewed San Antonio as a place to be free. Information about freedom had begun to spread throughout Texas. Usually, enslaved people couldn't leave their plantations or ranches, but there were other ways to gather information about their surroundings. For example, enslaved women traveled working as nurses, midwives, and cooks. Enslaved men traveled more often than women. They accompanied their enslavers on trips or ran errands, and this movement of enslaved people was linked to the spreading of rumors and information. Additionally, local laws usually allowed enslaved people to not have to work on Sunday, and they shared news within their neighborhoods, which was made up of adjacent plantations. And so all of these are some of the ways that Peter and John likely learned about freedom in San Antonio. So while other Mexican states offered freedom because of abolition, the distance to reach them was very far, especially for people with a limited understanding of long distance across space. So San Antonio was closer, but it presented other challenges, such as how long freedom there would last, which leads to my third point. The commander at San Antonio decided to offer refuge to Peter and John. However, archival sources did not detail or explain what the freedom for the father and son would look like more long-term. Where would they live? How would they eat? Where would they work? How would they be protected from kidnapping? And so before these questions could even be adequately considered, the kidnappers ended the short-term freedom that the commander had offered. And so lastly, while enslaved Texans viewed San Antonio as a place to be free, enslavers and kidnappers knew that freedom seekers would escape there. So They always would try to get to San Antonio first, or shortly thereafter, just waiting for them to arrive. And we see that these kidnappers knew because they arrived so quickly. As I said, Peter and John arrived there in April. By the end of May, they'd already been kidnapped and returned to Texas slavery. And so this example goes against what we typically think about with freedom seekers. Usually, you're probably most familiar with kidnapping as a part of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, where freedom seekers had found freedom in the North, and then because of this law, they could be accused of being a freedom seeker or formerly enslaved and then returned to slavery. And so we're seeing an example of kidnapping predates 1850. So many people tried to escape slavery, but we typically only hear about the successes and not the stories of those people who were not successful. And so Peter and John's temporary freedom was the main issue with San Antonio being an informal state of freedom. The freedom seekers thought the city would offer them freedom, and a Mexican official made it so. However, without a formal recognition of this freedom, the father and son remained vulnerable. What if Musquiz had changed his mind? How long would this freedom have existed if they had not been kidnapped? Despite what enslaved Texans imagined about the possibilities of freedom in Texas and their short-lived experiences as free people, was an example of the growing surveillance in the Republic of Texas to ensure that enslaved people would not find refuge there. And this surveillance would continue to grow when Texas became a U.S. state. In late December 1845, a party of 25 freedom seekers ran away from Bastrop, Texas. It's about 100 miles north of here. Members of the group were armed. They had stolen, quote, some of the best horses that could be found, end quote. And they believed that the freedom seekers hadn't escaped on their own. They believed that local Mexicans had helped them in some way, and that their goal was to get to towns across the Rio Grande. And so to stop the fugitives from reaching Mexico, the town got together in pursuit of them, but they were concerned that they would not be able to catch up and overtake them. A few weeks later, the sheriff of Gonzales County, H. McCulloch, had kidnapped 17 of the 25 freedom seekers near the Guadalupe River. Although the other 8 freedom seekers likely continued their journey, the newspaper praised McCulloch for his, quote, energy and promptness in the pursuit and capture of these Negroes, end quote. And the article said that he would be amply rewarded for his efforts. And so this escape shows us, again, how the planning process of escape had changed in Texas. So the first thing that might stick out to you is that abolitionists and enslaved people who escaped north typically believed that large groups hindered success, but in Texas this was not always the case. So enslaved Texans in the antebellum era thought about escape in entirely different ways than people enslaved in the upper South, like Virginia, and in the lower South, like South Carolina and Georgia. Because so many people fled from Bastrop in this instance, it was not a quiet escape. There were horse hooves, there were gunshots, so not the secretive and stealthy escape that we always think about when people were running away to freedom in the North. Another difference was it was such a large group. Usually when escaping north, the typical profile was a single man between the ages of 16 and 25, prime working years. And sometimes romantic couples escaped together. And this source doesn't give the demographics of the escape, but I suspect that women and children were also part of this group. And women and children were historically excluded from escape. So one reason to explain why this was such a large group was that the group likely included West Africans. And you're probably thinking, well, where did West Africans come from in 1840s Texas? While the United States officially ended its participation in the Atlantic trade of kidnapped Africans by 1808, the Republic of Texas prohibited it in its 1836 Constitution. Traders illegally imported between 500 and 1,000 West Africans to the Republic of Texas in the 1830s. And so these people were likely part of this illegal entry. And so these ideas about what freedom looked like for them, running away as a community effort, maintaining community, friendship, and familial ties allowed them to free as many people as possible. Another difference was that they were armed. By the 1840s, most enslaved people and even free black people in the South could not legally own or use firearms. But in Texas and the Texas-Mexico borderlands, using guns was part of survival. So I was reading a travel diary about a British man who traveled through Texas during this time, and he remarked that he was so surprised that every traveler he encountered was armed. And so we're seeing how this also applied to enslaved people. Enslaved people worked as cowboys, they worked as ranch hands, they had access and expertise in guns that enslaved people in other areas of the U.S. South just did not have. And this was a skill that helped them escape. Lastly, the access to horses made their experience unique. Traveling on horseback, of course, allowed them to reach their destination faster, but most fugitives from slavery who fled to the north escaped on foot. Again, in Texas and the Texas-Mexico borderlands, horses were part of how people made their living and traveled, and this was another skill that helped them run away. So we've talked about the differences. One similarity that I want to highlight is that this escape happened around the holidays. And for us, we think about the holidays as a time for celebration, getting together with family and friends, and generally a happy time. But it was the opposite for enslaved people, mainly because they feared sale. At the end of the year, enslavers who were running a business, for lack of a better phrase, they balanced their budgets, they were sorting out debts, calculating their profits. And so if the enslaver couldn't cover debts, they often sold enslaved people to get cash. And so this usually happened at the end of the year. And so people ran away if they feared sale and separation from their loved ones and their friends. And so escape during the holidays was actually more common because people were more likely to get a pass to travel, to leave the plantation. And also there was less work, so the enslaver or the overseer might not notice them gone because there was limited work during the holidays. And so based on what I've detailed, I want you to think about this escape and escapes more generally as being very strategic. People carefully planned their escape. In this case, they told others, they stole weapons and horses, and they tried to make their way to Mexico as best they could. Unlike Peter and John, the fugitives from slavery likely knew that they could not be free in San Antonio. I think this is why they carried so many items and had so many people when they fled slavery. They imagined themselves as free people across the Rio Grande and relied on skills, stolen items, and the people who were part of their escape to cross the river. And so for the case of the 25 freedom seekers and the capture of some of the group members near the Guadalupe River signals that they were heading towards San Antonio as part of their journey to cross the Rio Grande. So San Antonio remained an important part of Texas freedom seekers' escape. If you recall Andreas from the beginning of my presentation, as early as the 1810s, enslaved people from northern Louisiana escaped to the then Spanish Texas capital, hoping to be free. Even though the prospect of freedom in the city had changed, it still remained an important part of escape in Texas. And so there were a few characteristics that made San Antonio ideal for fugitives who had traversed hundreds of miles across Texas. So first, as you know, there was a river. Many freedom seekers went without water, they were dehydrated, and so the San Antonio River provided water, a place to bathe, a place to rest. It was also a marker. For many fugitives, getting lost was a part of their escape. San Antonio was a marker to reorient freedom seekers who had become lost and help them continue southward. For enslavers, the city marked or represented the progress that a freedom seeker had made. When researching in the archives and looking at Texas newspapers, I kept noticing that the reward money increased if a fugitive from slavery escaped south of San Antonio. And one reason to explain this was that the city, which was estimated to have between 3,000 and 5,000 people, was majority Mexican. Enslaved people thought they might receive assistance from Mexicans, and Anglos thought that Mexicans who were not elite were in cahoots with enslaved people to sabotage slavery by giving freedom seekers directions and helping them escape. And even without evidence, the mere idea that enslaved black people and Mexicans had aligned created difficulties and long-term consequences for Mexicans in Texas. In the 1840s, enslavers and pro-slavery residents blamed Mexicans almost when enslaved Texans fled to Mexico. If you recall from the story with McCullough and the 25 freedom seekers, the article also blamed local Mexicans for their escape. And this was part of a larger anti-Mexican sentiment that had been growing in Texas. since shortly after the Texas Revolution. There were fears of Mexican invasion, fear that Tejanos were still aligned with Mexico. And these fears, plus the potential threat to slavery in Texas, made Mexicans targets. For example, in summer 1842, someone discovered a Mexican man, quote, lurking upon a plantation near San Felipe, end quote. And so the owner of the plantation arrested the man and interrogated him, and he learned that the man had, quote, been enticing several of his slaves to run away with him to Mexico, end quote. And so the enslaver punished the Tejano by cutting off his ears, whipping him, and banishing him to south of the Rio Grande. And so the article that I read this in closed by warning other enslavers to, quote, be on their guard lest their slaves should be enticed away by Tejanos, end quote. And these fears were not far-fetched. Tejanos could be an important part of freedom seekers' journey. They were familiar with the local surroundings and routes to Mexico. They could guide fugitives from slavery through Texas or provide detailed information about how to reach the Rio Grande. For enslaved people who weren't allowed to leave the confines of their plantations and ranches, just receiving information about where to go and how to get there were significant advantages. For enslavers, Mexicans in Texas became convenient scapegoats used to explain enslaved resistance. Enslavers had this idea that enslaved people were happy, that slavery saved black people by introducing them to Christianity and by making sure they were not idle. And so instead of focusing on the horrible conditions that might explain why someone escaped, like beatings, rape, whipping, separation of families, they focused on blaming local Mexicans for enticing Texans in bondage to find freedom across the Rio Grande. And so one of the long-term consequences of this blame was Mexican expulsion from Texas towns. At an 1855 meeting in Caldwell County, attendees were frustrated with the, quote, continued tampering of Mexicans with Negroes, end quote. They complained that they couldn't allow Mexicans into the county anymore because, quote, their sympathies are all with the Negro, end quote. And so they resolved to order all the Mexicans from the county. Expelling Mexicans from Caldwell County was part of anti-Mexican violence that already existed in Texas. Anglos used mob violence to instill fear and displace Mexicans from their land. Under the pretense of punishing Mexicans who undermined slavery, Anglo-Texans used these accusations to enact more physical and economic violence in Mexican communities. Ultimately, local Mexicans in Texas experienced very real consequences for their real or imagined associations with enslaved Texans. Not only Mexicans experienced more scrutiny, but also other residents in Texas who might be suspected of assisting freedom seekers. The one way to ensure that everyone would participate in hindering black freedom was to create new laws. At an August 1854 meeting in Bayard County, Texas, about the, quote, better security of slave property, end quote, members offered $200 reward for the apprehension of a fugitive from slavery who was trying to get to Mexico, and $500 for anyone with information that led to the apprehension and conviction of any free person guilty of enticing, stealing, or carrying off an enslaved person. So based on this law, enslavers and people who supported slavery in the county offered more money for information about people who assisted enslaved Texans and escaped rather than the apprehended freedom seekers. So the threat of free people being sympathetic to enslaved people and undermining the system of slavery appeared greater than the individual escape. This law also allowed people who did not enslave black people to become part of maintaining slavery. It required that people become actively engaged instead of passive or indifferent about the issue of slavery. And of course, offering award money also encouraged people to participate. Lastly, members at this meeting stipulated that any enslaved people who were brought back from Mexico had to be closely guarded, and they couldn't associate with any other black people because they were concerned that these people might become contaminated with ideas of freedom in Mexico. And so ultimately they resolved to send these kidnapped freedom seekers off to a foreign market and where they wouldn't be able to return to Texas. So essentially, Anglos wanted to stifle the flow of knowledge about freedom in Mexico, and information about how to get there, and the residents determined that kidnapped fugitives would be sent to a foreign market, which was likely Cuba or Brazil. And so they were already in the Deep South, and so if you're familiar with people in the Upper and Lower South who were always fearing being sent down the river, for people in Texas, they were already downriver. And so enslavers had to find new ways and new places to punish and separate Black families and communities, and they turned to Cuba and Brazil to do this. And this law built on the ways that the Texas government was already involved in maintaining slavery. So Texas's police force became another part of the government that supported slavery. Its members, like McCullough, the sheriff of Gonzales County, monitored, hunted, and kidnapped enslaved people because they were willing to protect enslavers' financial interests by operating as state-sanctioned kidnappers. For enslaved people, the search for freedom was indeed illegal. Does anyone know the crime that they committed by escaping? Anyone? Yes, stealing yourself. Because if you do not own yourself, then you can steal yourself. And enslaved people were typically worth about $1,000, which is about $20,000 in today's money. So their values made people very, very motivated in trying to secure their return. And so police involvement in the pursuit of freedom seekers defined Black freedom as criminal. Criminalizing freedom reinforced white supremacy and ideas of Black inferiority. These ideas were part of a system where ordinary citizens, patrols, and the emerging police force impeded Black freedom and their efforts to reach Mexico. By the 1850s, jails and sheriffs became integral parts of the kidnapping process, and that they held captured fugitives from slavery until their enslavers arrived. Throughout the 1850s, advertisements for enslaved people who had escaped regularly mentioned the San Antonio jail as a place where the enslaver would be able to retrieve their property, or where enslavers actually requested the freedom seeker be detained. So here is an example of a freedom seeker named Gibb. In September 1850, 30-year-old Gibb escaped from Fayette County, Texas. He was a 6-foot-tall Black man. He was a blacksmith by trade. His advertisement that publicized his escape described him as smart and a good fiddler. His enslaver, C.H. Taylor, believed he had, quote, gone to Mexico. He offered $300 if someone captured him west of the Rio Grande and $200 if someone captured him west of the San Antonio River, and delivered him either to Fayette County or to W. Hindley and Company in Galveston. So after 3 months, Gibb still had not crossed the Rio Grande. In late December, someone saw him riding a gray stallion with a rifle gun, being lost and, quote, nearly starved, end quote. Gibb became desperate, and he gave himself up to a local Dutchman on the Medina near San Antonio. And so the Dutchman actually took him to an Anglo man so that Gibb could be placed in the San Antonio jail. However, Gibb never went to San Antonio. He was able to escape into the South Texas plains and continue his journey to Mexico. And I actually wanted to show you the overall, it's a very small piece of the newspaper that it's on. And so a few things I wanted to mention about advertisements more generally. Not every freedom seeker received an advertisement publicizing their escape. Some people were captured quickly, and so there was no need for an escape. And so some historians try to use advertisements as a way to count the number of freedom seekers, but it's not accurate because of what I explained. And then also, the newspaper was another way that people who did not directly enslave black people still benefited from slavery. So advertisements cost money, and so if you needed an advertisement placed, you would pay the newspaper editor or owner to print this advertisement about a fugitive from slavery. And then lastly, if you notice, it's a very small piece of the page, as I mentioned earlier. It's actually right below a notice about Irish potatoes coming in, and then there's a notice about a dentist and meat biscuits. And so it's a way to normalize the idea of slavery, and to normalize that it was nothing out of the ordinary to try to hinder black people from being free, because you would see these notices in the newspaper very casually placed among other issues going on. And so that was a way to sort of minimize the work of kidnapping, even when it appeared in print. And so San Antonio was part of this escape in two ways. It was a marker for the enslaved to designate a specific distance from slavery that determined reward money. And then the city's jail was also featured. It was supposed to be a holding place for Gibb. And both the Anglo-man and the Dutchman knew that the San Antonio jail was a place that would detain fugitives from slavery. And as more enslaved Texans escaped through the 1850s, Anglos began to call for the building of more jails in Texas. For example, Seguin, Texas residents demanded a local jail in 1853. When a German boy and a freedom seeker had escaped from, quote, the custody of the sheriff, end quote, the 1853 newspaper, the Texan Mercury, reported that people believed that they were journeying together to the Rio Grande. The article called for a building of a jail to properly punish people who had committed crimes, including freedom seekers. It said that the state had already, quote, relinquished the taxes in favor of the county for 2 years, and that there was no better purpose for the money than building a jail, end quote. And so in this example, jails were to restore order and punish people who had committed crimes. Restricting black people's freedom was part of this order. Tax dollars used for jails was another way the government and people who did not enslave black people participated in the maintenance of slavery. And so thinking about this intersection of jails and tax dollars was another way the institution relied on many different sources to exist. So in conclusion, the experiences of Texas freedom seekers were unique from what we learned in school or from other books about freedom seekers. This is an emerging history of flight to Mexico that forces a reconsideration of how enslaved people thought about escape and the role of Mexico in U.S. slavery, among other ideas. More importantly, and for the purposes of this symposium today, this work recasts San Antonio as not just a big city in Texas or a big city in the United States, but also a place that has deep roots and ties to slavery and freedom in possibly similar ways as Charleston, South Carolina, Philadelphia, or New York City. And using this framework, we can begin to think about the national and international consequences of Texas and U.S. slavery. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah. Dutch. Oh, Dutch? Dutch from the Netherlands? Yes. Dutch. It is. Oh, sure. She asked, so the first person asked what I was saying. So Dutch, as in someone from the Netherlands or Holland. The next question was, what newspaper is this from? And it is from the Texas Monument. Oh, yeah. Yes, the Texas Monument, and February 5th, 1851. Yes. So I will say a plug. The Portal of Texas is affiliated with the University of North Texas. They actually have these newspapers that I looked through during the early years of the pandemic. New Jersey closed all of the libraries. I couldn't get any books. And I was like, oh, I'm not going to be able to work on my book. But then I stumbled across this resource, and I began looking through these newspapers to find examples of freedom seekers and their experiences. I used the keyword Negro, and I got about 12,000 hits. So I spent an entire academic year going through all 12,000 newspapers and collecting them and organizing them. Shout out to Dropbox. It has saved me many times. But this is a way for just a person who might be interested in this history. It's free. You can use it, different keywords. We can talk more about what keywords you want to use if you're interested in researching this topic yourself. Yeah.
So do I need to repeat that?
Yeah. So she asked about if there were any possibilities for assistance, like in Castroville and other areas. So I noticed that the closer freedom seekers got to Mexico, the less help there was. Also, just the conditions of the escape changed dramatically, so it became hotter and drier, and some people actually died and starved while trying to get to the Rio Grande. So unfortunately, it was like a catch-22. Like, you're getting closer to freedom, but the conditions of getting there are becoming more difficult, and it's actually stopping people from arriving there. So there's not a lot of help after they cross San Antonio, which is one reason why I think another reason why I think San Antonio was so important, because it was sort of the last place that you're going to stop before if you're going to get directions, if you're going to get food, if you're going to get water. San Antonio was the place to do that, because after San Antonio it became much more difficult. Not a lot of helpful people there. And Roseanne Barcha Garza talks about ferries and families who owned ferry landings who could ferry people across the Rio Grande. But for people who didn't know where they were going, like, how were you going to find a ferry landing? So very difficult to reach places that might be of use, because these weren't like publicly known. And so it actually became more difficult once they passed San Antonio, unfortunately.
We have an additional question right here.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Mia. I am a student at St. Mary's University. My question is kind of regarding that story you started off with us about Andres, and how you mentioned that he's Catholic. Is there any other instance in which religion has influenced a freedom seeker's decision to seek their freedom, to seek their own self-determination?
So not usually. When we think about the Underground Railroad and people escaping, we usually think about people using religion as a reason why they need to be a part of this movement. But in Texas, this is not the case. This was not the case. I've only come across one other mention of religion. They were a couple, and they had been enslaved in Louisiana. They were Catholic, and they wanted to escape to Spanish Texas so that they could actually get married in a Catholic wedding. And that's the only other time that I've seen religion mentioned as a part of freedom seekers and their escape.
Did you mention that a lot of your research you found at the University of North Texas?
For the newspapers, I did the portal to Texas History, which is affiliated with University of North Texas. But the bulk of my research actually happened at UT Austin at the Briscoe Center, and then in Mexico City at the National Archive there, which is, fun fact, it's actually a former prison. So they actually store the boxes in cells, and so anytime like someone gets a box, they like slam the door and it clanks shut. So kind of scary, but that's where, if you're doing research about Mexico, that you will end up there. So I ended up doing work in Mexico City and a former prison, and then also the Bristow Center. at UT Austin, where most of the research about Texas is centralized there, and just a little bit at the Texas State Archive.
I was going to mention, I don't know if the speaker later is going to speak about the Tejano cartmen and the Tejano cart wars. Yeah, are they going to?
Oh, I don't. Are they?
What I wanted to add is that El Camino Real, of course, followed the river, and if anybody was on foot or even with horses, they had to water the horses.
Right.
And some of the Tejano cartmen were having trouble with the Anglo traders about it being in competition. You know, my ancestors, they've been already trading all the way into Mexico and back with no borders and no problems, except of course fording the rivers, etc. But you know, in 1857, a lot of the Tejano cartmen were lynched, and part of that was because they were suspected of aiding some of the former enslaved. I wanted to ask about Gibb. Was he on foot or was he on a horse?
He was on a horse, but unfortunately he still got lost and still had trouble. As I mentioned earlier, becoming lost was just part of the freedom seeker experience. If you read any narratives, even for people escaping north, they talk about getting lost. They talk about going around in circles because without a map, without anyone to ask for help, they just had to sort of muscle through on their own.
Well, I want to assure you that, I mean, it was really a highway kind of in that sense, that I think by the 1850s, there were anywhere from 500 to 1,000 carts traveling from Indianola to La Bahia, and then also this way. And of course, I understand that most of the former enslaved that crossed the river a lot of them settled in Piedras Negras, which would have been going through from San Antonio south, which is now I-35, I think, heads there.
Yeah.
And I think that some of the cartmen, obviously, I would hope that my ancestors, if they saw somebody, they helped on the way.
Yeah. Oh, and I just wanted to thank you for bringing up the point as the El Camino being like a highway. For enslaved people, they tried to stay away from main roads, so they always had to travel adjacent to main road, which is, I think, another reason why they got lost, because if you lose sight of the main road, then your journey's taking a turn that you didn't plan for. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. And also thank you for sharing your family history.
Okay. In your opinion, how much did this friction between the Mexican and white Texans concerning slavery contribute to like the Texan War for Independence?
Oh, well, I mean, before 1836, there was some tension, but not in the way that we'd see after the revolution. Before that, the Mexican government had made a lot of concessions to Texas regarding slavery, so they thought everything was okay until they visited in like 1832, 1833. That's when they realized things weren't okay, and they tried to use different laws to curtail slavery in Texas, and also control the number of white people from the United States, but where they moved in Mexico. Originally, they wanted them to move throughout Texas, but they all congregated in East Texas because they were concerned that indigenous people would kill them, and that was the right fear to have. Because they didn't like the arrival of white people from the United States displacing them. So a lot of the anti-Mexican sentiment actually comes after the Texas Revolution, and then as slavery begins to grow, as I mentioned, there are more people escaping, and they're like, well, enslaved people are happy, so they would never escape on their own. Who's causing this? I know, Mexicans. And so they began to blame them for any resistance. As I mentioned, going through the newspapers, like 12,000 of them, it was like a regular occurrence. That anytime someone escaped, there was usually the article would usually say Mexican in it. And so, in a way, slavery, I included this because I wanted to show the ways that slavery and anti-Mexican sentiment in Texas became linked in the 1840s and 1850s, and some of the 1860s. And as you know, anti-Mexican sentiment continued well into the 20th and 21st century. So, here we are.
Hi. Thank you again, Doctor, for this presentation. Towards the very beginning, you had mentioned that Guerrero had already abolished slavery in Mexico in 1829, but that Texas was an exception. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. So, if you didn't know, Mexico was very progressive in 1829. They abolished slavery, and so they elite Tejanos and politicians from Coahuila actually petitioned Guerrero to get an exemption for Texas specifically, because they also had economic interests in Texas, like they owned land in Texas, and so they wanted to make sure that Anglos in Texas were happy, so they actively agitated to have Texas receive an exemption. They said it was a violation of the 1824 Mexican Constitution, which was supposed to protect people's rights and property rights specifically. And so they said, if you're trying to take people, if you're trying to abolish slavery, you're trying to take people's property, and so you were violating their constitutional rights, among other complaints. And so they were successful. In November 1829, he said, you can have an exemption. And so Texas received an exemption.
So I'm researching a man named Felipe Alua, who was actually a slave that came here, and on the census record of 1804, he came from Louisiana with Joseph de la Bombe, and it says esclavo, and then it's scratched out and it says sirviente.
Yeah.
So he didn't get his official papers until 1829 or something.
Yeah.
But then he sort of disappears about 1840, and so I'm curious. I find his daughter's death certificate in Matamoros, and his son has an altercation with slave traders who come across the Rio Grande and capture him and bring him back, and Mexico makes them give him back to Mexico. But I'm curious about your resources that you were able to use in Mexico, because I think maybe that's where I have to go to find out what happened to Felipe Alua.
Yeah. So for a few years, like northeastern Mexico was like a little dicey. I've spoken, Maria and I have spoken, Dr. Hammock and I have spoken about this. We've also spoken to other scholars. So it is safer. You definitely will need to know Spanish to be able to navigate the archives. I actually came across him in my own research. I don't know if you've been to the Texas State Archives, because he shows up in the Nacogdoches archive that they have a microfilm. Yes, you have seen that. So yes, but I was curious about him as well, and I noticed that his trail goes cold, and that's actually a larger issue that people who study this have. That people like disappear from the record, and you wonder, well, what happened to them? So I would say for the archives for Matamoros, did you go to the Briscoe Center? They actually, okay, so that's where you started, the Briscoe? Oh, okay. Because the Briscoe Center actually has the Matamoros City Archives, like, Either it's in boxes or, unfortunately, the dreaded microfilm. I don't know how you feel about that, but they have them and they're really great. They're very helpful, so you could actually call them before you go or email them before you go, saying this is what I'm looking for. Do you still have this? Can you get it out of storage, wherever it is, and then they can have it for you ready to go when you arrive. And sometimes, depending on the archivist, you can tell them very specifically what you're looking for, and the person might actually know what box or what reel you need to look for, so then you aren't blindly searching for, one little thing.
My question is, well, two questions. One, I know a little bit about your background. I read a little bit of your bio. I would like to know what prompted your interest in this. Do you have roots in Texas? Were your ancestors from here? I mean, you do your research. Well, you're based out of Rutgers. I think that's fantastic that somebody so far removed from South Texas is joining with Dr. Hammock in this. That's wonderful. I want you to talk a little bit about how you got to this, and is San Antonio becoming part of the national discussion about self-emancipation and things like that? And what are the implications? Where is the research going? Is it stalled? What can we do? That's a lot to unpack.
Well, that might actually, that is fine. Yes. So to answer your first question, this research, I'm finishing up a book now. I'm hoping it will go to the editor later this year. So it actually came about when I was an undergrad. I was in an English class, actually. It was about, we had to read narratives of people who had escaped. So that's all we did for the class. And we were reading I think it was a narrative of Henry Box Brown, and the professor mentioned that Frederick Douglass hated this narrative because he hated that Henry Box Brown had explained in detail how he had escaped, because he's like, well, now no one else will be able to use this method because you published this book and you told all your secrets. So, and so that made me start thinking about how people, like Henry Box Brown escaped from Richmond and he mailed himself to Philadelphia in a crate. And so it made me begin to think about how people's approaches to escape changed as they got farther away from the North. And so I raised my hand and I said, well, someone from Louisiana obviously isn't going to mail themselves to to Philadelphia, and like walking from Texas to Philadelphia seems like a really long walk. And so I said, has anyone ever escaped to Mexico? And she didn't know. And so I was a history major, so I asked my professors, and they didn't know either. And then I went to the library, and there weren't any books. And so my professor said, I think you should go to graduate school and pursue this topic. And originally I said no, because I was like, 6 years is a really long time. And that sounds like a lot of work, and it was. But then she was like, well, I really think that this is important for, like, not only like and historians say a new direction in the Underground Railroad, and they mean like looking at something new, but she's like, you're literally talking about a new direction. So I think you should go and pursue this topic. And so I did, and I did the research. People asked me, how did I learn Spanish? A very silly story. When I was, my dad lives in New Mexico. I visited him over the summer, and he said that I couldn't lay around all summer, and I had to get a job. And so I applied to the local McDonald's, and I thought that they weren't going to take me, but they did. And so I was upset because now I couldn't lay around all summer. And so when I got there, I realized that everyone was speaking Spanish. And then a person was like, oh, you speak English, good, because there's only one other person on this ship who speaks English. So for the I'd taken like high school Spanish, but then I learned that high school Spanish isn't real. And so, and so for the whole summer, I spoke Spanish, because if you wanted to say anything not on the McDonald's menu, like, hey, how are you? You had to say it in Spanish. And so that's where my Spanish comes from. A lot of my colleagues have like very fancy fellowships, but people ask me and I'm like, oh, McDonald's. So that is the answer to your first question. The second question, Texas is unfortunately way outside of conversations about freedom seeking and escape and abolition. hardly anyone is speaking about it. There's this idea that Texas is more like west than south, but obviously that is not true. But I think one of the things might be the language barrier. So you do need to know Spanish and be willing to read 19th century Spanish handwriting to do this history. And so some people don't have the skills. And then for other people, Texas isn't on their radar in that way. So when people talk about Texas in the 19th century, they're talking about indigenous violence or indigenous genocide, displacement. They're talking about the Texas Revolution. They're talking about the experiences of Mexicans in Texas. So unfortunately, the experiences of Black people, both free and enslaved, remains in the margins of an already marginalized history. So a long way to go on that front. Anytime I go to conferences, I talk to people about my work and they say it's really interesting. But then when I say, hey, let's do something together, they're not interested. So I think for some people, they haven't made like that mental acceptance of when you think about slavery in the United States, you need to think about Texas. And when you do that, there are international implications of doing that, because now you need to think about Mexico. Now you need to think about Spain. Now you need to think beyond like the northern United States and Canada and think about North America as a whole and how different spaces of freedom arose on the continent.
So my question is not a question, it's a comment. And it's not a
okay.
comment for you. No. Actually, it's to her, the question that you asked about Felipe Lua. I found a lot of his documents at El Museo de Antropología y Historia. They have a small library in Mexico City, and a lot of these records are there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Oden. It's fantastic. My question for you, which kind of goes back to one of the questions earlier, was to what degree are Mexicans and Tejanos being scapegoated by enslavers who just couldn't possibly believe that enslaved people would want their own freedom? So are they being scapegoated, or have you recognized individual efforts by Mexicans and Tejanos to assist freedom seekers, or organized efforts in any way, shape, or form?
So I've come across sources where Tejanos like actually participated, like they went with the freedom seeker to Texas, like as a guide. And so I've seen that about 5 or 6 times where people are like, oh, you want to escape to Mexico? I'm already going. Let's go together. So we see that. But in terms of like a coordinated effort, Anglos have said this, but I haven't found evidence of people actually getting together and saying, we're going to assist enslaved people in this town and we're going to do X, Y, and Z.
Hello, Dr. Auden. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was just wondering, in your research, have you ever encountered anything about abolitionists in Texas and the roles that they may have played, or the extent to which they were not allowed to play a role?
Right. So yes, people have been accused of being an abolitionist. I actually haven't seen a lot of direct abolitionist work for people who study slavery in Texas and people who escaped. We think of it as largely being the enslaved person having to plan and execute the escape on their own. And if they do receive assistance, it is unexpected or spontaneous assistance that they receive along the way. So people were accused of being abolitionists. People have been in Texas, mainly in North Texas. There was this idea in the 1850s that abolitionists in North Texas were encouraging enslaved people to escape, but also encouraging enslaved people to set fires. So there were a number of fires in the region in the 1850s, and they blamed it on enslaved resistance, and really it was just hot. So, but it was another way in this idea of who can be a scapegoat for encouraging enslaved people to escape. And so saying that there was a large abolitionist community any place in Texas is a wild, wild notion, because it just wasn't true. But it was a way to explain enslaved resistance, and it was a way to scapegoat maybe people in town that you didn't like, or people who might be threatening Texas slavery, that you believe might be threatening Texas slavery in some way. Thank you so much.
Dr. Michaela Audane, all the way from New Jersey. Let's give it up for her again. So one of the things that we talk a lot about at SACAM is the names and the unnamed of the enslaved people. We hear it's easy to find the names of the enslaver. It's easy to learn about the lives of the enslaver. It's much more difficult to even find the names of the enslaved. What you have in front of you, if you're sitting at a space, you have a ribbon. Students from St. Mary's University have researched names of people that have passed through San Antonio that were enslaved. On your ribbon, you have one name, and I believe some of them may have a couple more than one. What we encourage you to do is think about in 2020 during, some people would call it the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. I just call it as maybe a window into it because in my life, Black lives have always mattered. But we said, say their name, say her name. So I want you all right now to get your ribbon and look at it and say their name. Let's say it all together. Let's give voice to those people that didn't have a voice. So on the count of 3, and it's not 1, 2, 3, and then we'll do it on 3. So 1, 2, 3. Say, thank you. As you hear names mentioned today, and we heard Dr. Audane mention at least 3, we invite you to add their names to your ribbon. That ribbon is yours. We do have more ribbons in the back. There are markers around the table. And so as you leave here today, you can think about, wow, I've given a name to someone who may not have had a name. I've given space to someone who didn't have space to call their own and had to fight for it. We're going to take a short break as we kind of maneuver with the presentations, and we'll come back in 10 minutes. So that's 10:55, I believe. Is that right? We'll come back at 10:55 to hear from the San Antonio Missions and their role in the fight and flight to freedom. Thank you. Thank you again so much for being here. There's so many other places you could be on a Friday, but to come out and learn with us, that's awesome. You'll notice if you're looking at a program at the end of the day, we're super excited to break up into smaller groups for a short time to discuss, now that we have this information, what are we going to do with it? So that means you will have to pay attention. There won't be a test, but it will be that discussion. And we're going to walk away with some things that we can do to make our city a better place. I have the distinct honor presenting Ranger William Bozick. William Bozick, the National Park Service.
Thank you, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. I am currently assigned to the San Antonio Missions National Historical Park, which is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and hopefully soon a member of the Network to Freedom. And as just mentioned, I am so grateful to have you here. We're in the city of San Antonio with so much to see and do. We're going to add San Antonio missions to that see and do in reference to freedom seekers. My program today I'm going to cover will be in essentially three portions. First, I have to get the national government kind of message across, and I'll do that. Then we're going to talk. I've got my supervisors here. Then we'll do what I would call audience-centered program, and then finally we have an amazing case story that I hope will answer some of the questions that you have and provide you with some clues for where to explore. So those will be the three segments. Okay, here we go. I'm going to read this out loud. I have a Here we go. I'm going to repeat a little bit so we get it to the tape. And apologize. The National Park Service, San Antonio Missions National Historical Park, acknowledges the San Antonio River as the Yanaguana spirit waters, and that's in Payaya. Payaya were an indigenous group native to the San Antonio area, in the area of what would be today San Pedro Springs, where water flows up from the Edwards Aquifer and forms the San Antonio River. It's a little more than the statement, but the ancestral homeland of numerous and distinct indigenous peoples since the immemorial, whose direct descendants are among us today. The acknowledgement honors the unbroken ties between the indigenous peoples and their traditional lands and waterways. Okay, now, how did you specifically spark an interest in this topic? Think on that for just a moment. What was it that sparked your interest? And if we think, and I'll go from the corner here, perhaps if you're around my age, Roots by Alex Haley, the famous TV miniseries that really opened up America Some of us are old enough to remember that. This topic really hadn't been covered until that miniseries, and then all of a sudden, people became interested in genealogy and obviously the struggle for freedom. Maybe it was a place that you visited. The National Park Service, in addition to our park, we have Cane River Creole National Historical Park, and that is in Louisiana, not too far from here. Easily a drive that you could go visit. I will tell you, San Antonio Missions is closer. Okay. Perhaps the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, or even better, because Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a fictional account, 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northrop, an original by an eyewitness. So you know it's got to be the truth, and it's a very disturbing truth. And both of those books opened people's eyes. Many people became abolitionists after reading these books, and then these would be in the mid-1800s. Perhaps an individual like Harriet Tubman, who you see featured on a U.S. postage stamp. Perhaps the movie Diary of Miss Jane Pittman, also fictional, but that also raised people's awareness. And then finally, recent news, or somewhat recent, we have Michelle Obama, Barack Obama's wife, whose ancestor was an enslaved human being, and a monument was placed. And of course, that made big news. So any of these, and then I ask you, perhaps you have something different. Okay. What was it that sparked your interest? Maybe a family member, maybe DNA test, etc. What was it that brought you here today? For the National Park Service, we're about to celebrate the semi-quincentennial of American independence, a struggle for freedom with liberty and justice for all. Think back to April 19, 1775. About 400 people stand up and take a stand, and there's gunfire with the government, and that would be the British government. And it leads us on a road to independence, emancipation from British rule, with the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all people. That story, probably all of you already know. What we're going to try to take a look at is underrepresented communities whose stories are just as valuable and just a part of the thread of America as all the others. So that's what we're going to try to accomplish in the coming years with the semi-quincentennial. Pardon me, I keep wanting to say quinceañera. My wife and I, we have 3 daughters, so you get the idea. So 250 years, and we're going to take a look at the national park, but particularly today, like I said, the second portion of the program, we're going to take a look at the North Star or the Southern Cross. And I know, Miss Michaela, you covered that in your excellent program before. Let's take a look. Slavery is banned in Canada and in Mexico. Okay. Past scholarship, and pardon me for reading this out loud. Popular understanding of the Underground Railroad is everybody's headed north to Canada. Follow that North Star. Countless Hollywood films, TV shows, North Star, North Star. How accurate is that? Well, let's take a look. We have some contextual history. In a database of 777 runaway slave notices, 559, you can see 75% mention going to Mexico. And then you have only 2 of 777 that mention going to even northern states, let alone Canada. We have the map of the state of Texas, and you will see our county, Bexar County right here. And you see the areas based on the 1860 census where there's major enslavement. And you'll notice that our county is not included in that. You also will notice that Mexico is not that far away going this direction rather than directly south. And so many people seeking freedom in Mexico would have probably gone here before going into the Mexican border, United States. So why San Antonio missions? I mean, Bexar County is a big county. Why direct yourself towards the missions? And by the way, this is a photo of the Convento area at Mission San Jose. A great place to visit, okay? You know what I'm going to say. All right. And it's part of El Camino Real de los Tejas. This is something that some of the people had asked questions about earlier. This is going to go through San Antonio to the Mexican border. And you'll also notice that we have the Cane River Creole National Historical Park, the Big Thicket, the Waco Mammoth, Lyndon Johnson, all of these parks and this route. Now, here in Texas, part of that route, when we think about it, it's going to start off probably as a nature trail where animals are traveling. And then indigenous people follow that trail. And eventually settlers follow the trail. And today, throughout much of Texas, it's Interstate 79. And you go into Louisiana, and it's Louisiana Highway 6. And along the route, we have markers for El Camino Real de los Tejas. This is the Royal Road. At one point in time, and this would be during the Spanish colonial era, the capital of Texas would have been at the end of this road. It would have been in Robeline, Louisiana, just off of Highway 6. So that's the capital of Texas, in Louisiana. Nobody's laughing or smiling. Okay. Save that for when I talk. So you can see the path, and this would have been the natural route. Enslaved people would not have just stayed on the land. They would have traveled with their enslavers to do chores. So they would have been working as trade was going on. This route kind of would have been fairly well known to everybody. And so we think that many of the people would escape following this route. Certainly not, right on it, but close to it. Now, our missions. This is our park, and you'll see the 4 churches that make up the San Antonio Missions National Historical Park. Keep in mind, there were 6 missions. 4 of them, National Park. A 5th, which is San Antonio de Valero, better known as the Alamo. And that is Texas General Land Office that has jurisdiction. And then there's another one that's underneath a golf course, and we're just not going to talk about that today. So we have the missions which are along the San Antonio River, and this would have been a natural place for freedom seekers to go. We're going to find out why in just a moment. In the mid-1850s and 1860s, we have Benedictine monks. They're from Latrobe, Pennsylvania. They're well known as abolitionists. So if you are a person trying to flee to freedom, and and everybody does, these are abolitionists, This is going to be a friendly place to visit. Okay. We also had the tradition of the Roman Catholic community. And then finally, the Mexican community, which has been mentioned often. They're described in the San Antonio Herald from August 18 to May 23rd of 1759 as being cooperative to freedom seekers. Now, it's a challenge because as a historian, we're digging up information that was clandestine at the time. Okay, so we've got to search, and that makes the assignment even more exciting because you're trying to find stories that haven't been told, the stories that people were actually trying to hide at the time. So when we look at the statement from the newspaper, and then we look at the census from the mission, we know these are the people at the mission. We just don't know who are those that are allies. Who are the ones that are helping? We just don't know that yet. That's an area that we're going to search so that we can give these people the proper credit for what they did at great risk. So we have a ballpark idea from the census. And by the way, every 10 years, the United States does a census. And the census is done in order to help create in the House of Representatives, representatives for Congress. Okay? Every state gets 2 senators, each state based on population, and there's our census, gets members in the House. So that's the reason for it. Okay, I'm going to read this out loud to you, and this is from the San Antonio newspaper, and it's the case of George and Wiley. That's the one that we're looking at right now. And it's going to provide us with some good clues. And we'll kind of follow through here. Again, I'm going to read this. My reading is terrible. I'm not wearing my glasses. It's all a vanity thing. They told me I'd be on TV. Okay. All right. Pardon me. $200 reward. Ran off from the subscriber living on the Cibolo on the 16th instance. That would be the 16th of August. 2 black boys, aged 18 and 20 years. Had on cotton clothes. Each took a heavy woolen pea jacket, new. They are supposed to be making for Mexico, one riding a young sorrel American horse, the other a mouse-colored Spanish pony, both branded on the left shoulder with ring and cross. George is very likely, he's bright countenance, speaks readily, and nearly 6 feet high. Small scar on the forehead, has lost his forefinger on his left hand. Wiley is about 5 feet 4 inches high, compactly set, small feet, dark countenance, snub nose, small eyes, slow of speech. If taken in the county, I will give $25 each for their delivery or lodgment in jail. If beyond its limits, towards the Nueces or Rio Grande, $50 each. And if taken in Mexican territory, $100 each. They had acquaintances with the Mexicans at the San Jose Mission, also at Panna Maria, and said before they left, they would make friends with some of them to help them off to Mexico. Okay, so we have A.G. Goodloe, and that's done in Bexar County on the 16th of August, 1859. So we've got a lot of clues. First, let's take a look at the map and find out, and the bar blue here is Mr. Goodloe's land. The blue over here is Panna Maria. And the blue dot over here is Mission San Jose. We have a neat website. This is not a National Park Service website, but it's plantations along the Cibolo Creek, and it's Lost Texas roads, and we can see where his plantation was. So we have another clue. Now, the horse brand. Okay. I'm going to think about this for a moment. We know it's a circle with a cross. So we have a brand registered to Mr. Goodloe's wife. And this is the brand. You see the circle with the cross. That's their cattle brand, or excuse me, that's their horse brand, and this is the brand they used for their cattle. But we also have a nearby neighbor who has the circle with the cross. Okay? So, you got to ask yourself, if you put yourself in George or Riley's shoes, would you take a horse from your enslaver? And obviously, if you're leaving with a horse, you're going to make quite a stir and people are going to notice. Or might you sneak off and then go to a neighbor and get a horse? That's the dilemma we're in. We just don't know. Both are plausible. And it's one of the challenges of this situation because it's all clandestine. Okay? So and I almost wish they'd have said, hey, brand, I'm going to do this, and it would be obvious for somebody in the National Park Service to discover years from now. But it just wasn't that simple. Yeah. So, what do you think? Now, how does this story end? Well, I'm a guy that likes to think of things a glass half full rather than half empty. So we did some research into documentation. We could not find an arrest in the Bexar County archives. It has not been found. It might be discovered. So far, no. So I'm kind of half full. I'm thinking they made it. The other thing that we found is if you look at the tax roll in 1859, Mr. Goodloe has enslaved 12 people. We know George and Wiley escaped in 1859. So 1860, had they been caught, say 12. Had they made it free to freedom successfully, 10. 1860, we have 10. 1861, we have 10. 1862, we have 10. Okay? So, thank you. So that would lead me, and again, I'm the half full rather than half empty. That would lead me to believe that they made their way to perhaps San Jose mission, met with one of the people at the mission or the priests, and were secretly sent to Mexico. And made their way to freedom. Because we don't have record of them not being successful. Now, again, I am the optimist, okay? And I want to point that out. There's other things that could have occurred. And that's what makes this so exciting. Trying to find out exactly and nail it down so that if we were in a court, we could have absolutely undisputable proof. Now, for us today as historians, when we're doing this kind of research, every time we have an answer, it leads us to more questions. Okay, more questions, and for this, maybe we will never have any absolute certainty. But again, I'm one of these guys that's like, let's look at the positive, and we know for certain. And I remember the previous speaker, Michaela. You'd mentioned we hear so much about north to Canada, not so much about south to Mexico, or even to areas in Texas that freed people would have lived. And that's what makes it, you're on the cutting edge. You're discovering and disseminating information about underrepresented groups that are part of that thread of American history. And that's what we at the National Park Service are trying to do. Okay, so that everybody in America has a part and we are all served by the National Park Service. Are there any questions? Yes, ma'am. For his cattle, yes. And for his horses, yes. So when the taxman came to him, those 2 horses were missing. Now, one of the challenges is, you can breed, or and he was on the census, he's listed as a stock raiser. So what he's doing is he's breeding horses, he's also breeding cattle, and probably other animals. So if I were, or you and I were trying to escape to freedom, that would be the place to go. Okay, pardon the expression, a slice off a cut loaf is never missed. Yes, sir. Sure.
I'm listening to you. I have a map of the Underground Railroad. And my particular question is, can San Antonio say it was a part of the Underground Railroad?
Absolutely certain. Yes, 100%. No question about it. Yes, ma'am. I will get it for you, and I want to say San Antonio News Express, but that's but I will have that for you as soon as I'm done with the talk. I've got it written down. Yeah, that's what it. Zach? Oh, okay. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Thank you again for your presentation. So the map where you showed the trail, one of the trails, we hear a lot about indigenous artifacts being found at the missions. Are there anything to indicate that we found freedom seeker things left behind, or maybe, that were on the trail that they used in?
Okay. I'm going to deflect on that. It's out of my level of expertise, but we do have an archaeologist here. And I will introduce you to her, and she can take care of that question. I'm just a historian. We'll do that in the other time. Yes, ma'am. most of them can. Most. What you're going to do is the census records, they're everywhere. You can pull that up very easily online. The tax rolls also are available online. You're going to go to Bexar County. And Bexar County Archives, that would be the best place for the tax rolls. And yes, Family Search as well. There are a number of locations. I like personally the Bexar County Archives because not everything is available, worldwide. And if you go direct to the source, that's for myself as a historian, it's the quickest, easiest, and I think the best way to find that information. And what's neat, I'm sorry? Bear.org. Okay? Yeah, and I'm going to amplify, asked a question. The neat thing about this is, yeah, we do a census every 10 years. Still do it. The more recent census are protected for privacy, but you could go back and get the other census. Each 10 years, different questions are asked. And we have a census that is of enslaved people, which is separate from a census of just everybody. Okay? And then we also have a non-population census. And that's going to tell you, how many horses, how many wagons, crops that are grown, that sort of thing. And those are all great. But when you look at the Bexar County archives, this is where the tax man comes in, or tax woman. And they're going to check, and they're going to keep an eye on, how many chickens, how many pigs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it provides you additional information that you might not find in a census. Okay? And it's a year by year rather than a decade. So you can spot, like for our team, and we've got an outstanding group that it's not just me doing the research, all of us are working under my leadership. We're trying to find this information, and we're going through and we're saying, okay, we know George and Wiley escaped in 1859, so they're not going to be on the 1860 census unless they're not on 1860. Okay. Well, by 1870, that's after the end of slavery in 1865. Where do we find them? But if we look at the tax rolls, we find people. Okay, so that's why one of the benefits of Bexar County. Okay, sorry, I didn't want to go any further. Okay.
I know, I'm fine.
Thank you. That was our last question.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranger Bozick. We are going to make a computer adjustment here, but we're going to say their names. What were their names? Say it again. George and who? George and Wiley. So you want to write their names if you have a marker near you on your ribbon. George and Wiley. Thank you so much. Let's give it up for Ranger Bozick. So one of the things about this research, and to Miss Rosie's point about it being found, you can find information at the library. It's in all different places. And I'm so excited that we have young people here that are energized by this research that they don't get in the regular classroom. So we have some young people here, I believe as young as 16, because SAISD, they were not in school today. And we also have college students. So let's give it up for our student researchers. Thank you all. We appreciate everything that you do because it is a lot. Next, we have, I'm proud to say, SACAM's media mogul, Miss Lisa Jackson. She has a story for the ages.
Good afternoon. Morning, I'm sorry. Okay, so I am glad to be here today to share my family story. This comes from my mother's side of the family. And they talk a lot. I hope I pronounce it correctly. I think somewhere in Africa we might have been griots, or griots, how do you pronounce it? They never let a story die. And oral history. And the crazy thing about it is I've been listening to oral history all my life, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, blah, blah, blah. And it wasn't until I started doing the genealogy that everything that they told me actually was backed up by fact. I was like, what? But that is the history of most African Americans here in the United States. We have an oral tradition that has never been taken seriously until recently, and that's because I believe we hadn't had the access to back up what we were told. So this story starts with my grandfather. He was cute in 1920 something. So my grandfather, Forrest Bowles, would tell me a story when I was a kid all the time about his great-grandmother and how she ran away to Mexico and how my family was free before the Civil War ended. And he was like the rest of them. He embellished things and he'd laugh and he'd talk about it and he'd talk about everything. And so he passed away before I found a lot of the documentation, and I hate that because I wanted to be able to show it to him. Pampa, I wanted to be able to show it to him and say, look, Pampa, look what I found. But he was very excited, so I had to put him up there. That's Forrest Bowles. So we're going to start this story with my genealogy. Like most African Americans here in America, we are of European descent as well. African and European descent. So here is Abraham Milstead and Aaron Green Milstead. Abraham is born in 1784 in Virginia. He's a veteran of the War of 1812, and he is the father of Aaron Green Milstead, born in 1817 in Alabama. Green, as he likes to call himself, is a Civil War veteran and a slave owner as well. Mind you, their history goes back to 1656. Their ancestor was caught stealing in England. They put him on a ship and brought him over here. After they were emancipated, because they were indentured servants, the first thing they did was buy slaves. So, go to that. So, here is Abraham Milstead's enlistment papers in 1812. He was enlisted in Mississippi. So, this starts with Phyllis. This is my grandfather, Papa, his great-grandmother, Phyllis. She's born in 1824, and she dies in 1903. Her mother was from Africa, and we have the story of how she got here. She would tell the story of how her mother was picked up on the coast and everything that happened. We estimate her birthday to be 1805. So I have the initial from Africa to America story from Phyllis. Phyllis is purchased in Escambia County, Florida, which is where Abraham and Aaron Green live currently. And they have a large amount of slaves. But for some reason, Aaron Green seems to take particular interest in Phyllis. And Phyllis winds up having 4 children with Aaron Green. The first one in the first census of 1810, she has a 10-month-old child that we'd never see again. I don't find him again in 18, 20, 30, 40, or 50, or 60. What I do have is the 1850 census in Escambia, Florida. Aaron Green Milstead has a female age 24, color black, with a female child age 8, mulatto, and a male child 6 months, mulatto. The 8-year-old would be named Kate, and the 6-month-year-old would be named Pomp. So then the 24-year-old is my great-great-great-grandmother, Phyllis. Next, we find Aaron Milstead and slave and family in Fort Merrill, Live Oak, Texas. Now, how they got here, you got to imagine this. We all, we're so used to modern transportation, so we're like, okay, so you moved, right? You go somewhere and you move. But you're walking from where, if it's Virginia, if it's Maryland, if it's North Carolina, if it's Florida, if it's wherever it is, you're walking from there. He's running. Okay. If you ever Google Aaron Green Milstead, you'll find out he's a complete character. He likes to shoot people. He likes to do it. He likes to do a lot of stuff. So he's running. He and his father and his brother. There is a family lore that he murdered someone, and so they had to run. And they came from Florida, and then they went to Alabama, and they came here. I think the state boundaries between Alabama, Georgia, and Florida are a little fluid at that time, so it's kind of iffy where they were. But I did find a writ for court that I can't read. So if someone can read 19th century handwriting, it's crazy. But they are asking for Aaron Green to come to court to account for something terrible that he's done. But they're running. And so they come all the way down from Florida, and they walk everybody down. And now he owns 40 slaves. In 1850, he owned 3. Now he's 40, so they're moving on. He's a slave owner. So we're at 1860, and here is his daughter, my great-great-grandmother, and that picture is blurry, Mady Milstead. She is the daughter of Aaron Green Milstead and Phyllis, and she plays a part in the story because without her, I wouldn't be here. So that's Mady, and that's Pomp. I think I told you he was the 6.5-year-old in the 1850 census. The reason Pomp is here is I did tell you guys that Aaron Green Milstead was a character. I did tell you that, didn't I? So before 1860 ends, Pomp is gone, and so is Kate. The family lore says Phyllis, my great-great-grandmother, she would tell the story how they were in Bexar County at the time because they were walking. She went out to the fields to do some work where he sent her. When she came back to the cabin, her children were gone. Aaron Green Milstead sold his own children. So he sold Pomp out to East Texas to Gonzales, and they never found Kate until after the war ended, way after the war ended, closer to the turn of the century. So Phyllis lost her children, but she had Mady, was the last one. And the family lore is when she started crying, Milstead told her to shut up. But he sold his own. And that happens often. That's another part of slavery that they don't talk about. They had a bunch of children with the slaves, and they were property. They would sell their own children. So Pomp is gone, and Mady is still here. She's the last of Phyllis's children. So that plays a crucial part in what happens. The Civil War comes, and Milstead is enlisted in the Confederate Army. This is ironic because the Private Bowles, which is Dabney McGee Bowles, would be the father of her future husband. So that was ironic. Captain A.G. Milstead and Captain Bowles. So he's part of the Civil War. And while he's gone, he leases out Phyllis, because that was also a common practice. Sometimes they would lease out their workers, their slaves, to work other plantations or in other jobs, different things. And that person that they leased them to would pay the wages back to the slave owner. So he leased Phyllis out to a Mr. Gusset in Live Oak County. And family lore says that 5-year-old Phyllis ate a peach. She went to the tree, took a peach, and she ate it. And that enraged Mr. Gusset. And he threatened to whip a 5-year-old child because she didn't ask permission to eat a peach. Even though she's working, she's not like our 5-year-olds that play baby shark. She's a 5-year-old that she's working. She's hungry. And he threatened to beat her. And at that moment, Phyllis snapped. She lost it. She'd already been having children by a slave owner since she was 14 years old without her permission. He'd already sold her children without her knowledge and her permission. She'd already walked thousands of miles, and now she's down to one child, that's 5, and you're going to beat her because she ate a peach. Unfortunately for Mr. Gusset, there was a hatchet nearby. This is the part my grandfather liked most. That's the part he always liked. There was a hatchet nearby, and when Phyllis snapped, she grabbed the hatchet and she buried it in Mr. Gusset's head. That was not just the normal offense in America, because you would be killed just for not moving off the sidewalk fast enough, or disrespectful, or rolling your eyes to a white person. Now you put a hatchet in his head. You're gone. You're done. You're done. So with that being said, Phyllis takes Mady, 5-year-old Mady, and she straps her to her back, and they hightail it out because she knows that's it. There's nothing else for you to do. You got to go. So she runs, and she runs toward Fort Merrill, and so they run toward the B County Nueces area because she had friends and family there, white family friends and different things. And so it is family lore that a family by the name of Carlisle puts them in a wagon and heads them toward the border, halfway. They didn't get all the way. And where they end, I think I got it a little bit too big, but where they end up is in Cameron County, which is right here on the border. And they cross over into Mexico. And that's where they stay. Phyllis and Mady, they stay there until the Civil War ended. But Mr. Aaron Green, he's always in the story. Mr. Aaron Green does not want to end his relationship with Phyllis. And I guess she's a little bit smart. So he is a coward, per se. He's running from the Civil War. He was a captain. Now he's tired. He becomes a deserter, and he's running to Mexico, too, to get out of the Civil War. And that's, I don't know if that anybody's brought up that, but that's another story. There were a lot of Americans who ran to Mexico because they didn't want to serve in the Civil War. So there was a whole community down there. There was a whole community of escaped slaves, and there was a whole community of cowardly men who didn't want to fight in the Civil War. So he's running to Mexico too. But Phyllis says, if you want to be with me, you got to set me free. And he did. The paperwork is filed in the Cameron County courthouse, and I couldn't find it, but I have the reference to it, where I guess because she didn't know if the Civil, I guess you don't trust, they don't trust anybody, okay? That's really what it boils down to. She don't trust these people. You can have a Civil War and slavery ends, but a lot of them didn't trust white Americans. They didn't think so. They're like, y'all will be friends next week, and then next thing you know, you'll have us back in slavery. So she had him emancipate her, and he did. And they stayed in Cameron County and Hidalgo County as well until the Civil War ends. You'll find Aaron Green Milstead in your 1870 census set up in Hidalgo County with his family. Did I mention that he was married? I forget to tell y'all that part? That he was married with children? So you will find Aaron Green Milstead and his family in Hidalgo County from the 1870s all the way until his death, which I think is about 1893. The story ends eventually with Phyllis settling in B County, in particular Papalote and Skidmore, Texas. Any y'all ever heard of Skidmore, Texas? Hey, look at that. Oh yeah, you would know that. It's like, because nobody knows what Beeville is. Anybody know what Beeville is? Okay, yeah, okay. So that's what, yes, that's my mother's, so they're in Beeville, Papalote, Beeville, and Skidmore, which we still have family there to this day. That's my mother's side of the family. And she eventually marries a Dave Everhart. They live happily ever after. They have children, and Phyllis passes away in 1903, a much beloved member of the family. The crazy thing is they all talk about, because there were Native Americans that were still in that area, and they all talk about how Grandma Phyllis would just go down and talk to all of them in their language. She would much rather hang out with them than anyone else. So she knew the Native American language, and she knew their culture from living in Florida, and then the time spent in Mexico. She was very fluid. So they have 3 children, and you will find my great-great-grandmother, they have her down as Mary, but it's Mady Everhart at age 12 here in this census. Mady goes on to marry Peter Bowles. Remember I told you Mr. Bowles? Mady goes on to marry Peter Bowles. They would have 13 children, and one of their sons, Morris Bowles, was the father of my grandfather, Forrest Bowles. And that's just part of them. That's them old. Y'all saw them when they were young? They were cute, right? Then we all get old. And the hairline starts moving. And there we go. Okay, thank you. Did we have any questions? Yes, ma'am. Two different ways. The family, because I had a great uncle Playas Bowles, and he was a historian. Unfortunately, he liked to write all these stories on onion skin paper. I don't know if you guys know what that is. It's old, really thin paper. And the family always spelled it F-I-L-I-S, Phyllis. In the census records, they have it P-H, which the way we would normally spell it, Phyllis. So I included both. Yes, ma'am. But she asked how long did it take to do it. The crazy, now I've been, because I have, I researched my father's too, and they're Colorado County out there. It's been over 20 years, but that's just collecting little stuff because everything they said was there. That made it easy. It was like, oh, okay, well, here you go. And they stayed in the same place. They didn't move around. Once they got into the Papalote, Nueces, B County area, they stayed there for generations and generations. So it was easy to find them. But then, now you're going searching for pictures and extra documentation and da-da-da-da. But the census records were easy, clear, exactly where they were supposed to be, with the names the way they were supposed to be. But like I said, doing both sides of the family, it's taken quite a while. I have other runaway slaves in my family. We are honorary. but the other ones were up north, so they didn't go to Mexico. They went somewhere else. Yeah, we're honorary. Anyone else? That's it. Thank you. Maria.
Thank you, Lisa. And thanks to the Carver for bringing these disinfectant wipes because, of course, everyone knows the COVID cases are coming up a little bit, but they went down last week, right? And the vaccine is supposed to be out, I think, next week. So that's good. It's lunchtime. We have Miss Mona's Cuisine. I'm not quite sure if she's ready, but we will let you all, we're checking with her because we're a few minutes early, but lunch is set up there in the back. Please pay attention while you're eating to the slides that will be on the screen. We have quite a bit of research and runaway slave ads and things like that, and stories that will be circulating during lunch. After lunch, we're going to start at 1 o'clock sharp with Dr. Maria Hammock, all the way from the Ohio State University. Thank you.